Goeiedag! Good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And a link below is my last video on Ebola, where you can actually see what it's all about. And this is a very interesting video that's just been released by the United Nations, talking about the challenges of Ebola in Africa. And perhaps the most concerning thing in this whole issue is that one person can arrive in a city like Johannesburg or Soweto or wherever and have Ebola and spread it to hundreds of people, and it's like the Black Death. Now, what's the Black Death? The Black Death, also known as the Great Plague, or the Plague, or less commonly known as the Black Plague, was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia, and peaking in Europe from 1347 to 1351. That's your Black Plague. Imagine if Ebola gets into Johannesburg. And what you'll hear here in the video that's attached, this lady from the UN says, this sends an epidemic underground. This is a history of the Black Plague. Early identification of Ebola is headaches and fever. But, you know, you can imagine in the townships, you get a headache and fever, that's par for the course. And I'm just letting you know, Ebola is on your doorstep in South Africa. Please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Ring the bell for the updates, and I will put the link to my earlier video which has got all the information on Ebola about it. Take care. Bye for now.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As you know, today we mark 1 year since the Ebola outbreak was declared in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We are very pleased today to be joined from the RC by David Gressley, the Ebola Emergency Response Coordinator, and Dr. Ibrahima Sosefal, the Assistant Director General for Emergency Response for the World Health Organization. They are joining us from Beni. They will both do a short presentation, and then they will take your questions. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Mr. Gressley.
Well, thank you very much. I do want to make one small change. Dr. Fall had to travel, so he will not be with us today, but maybe, Margaret, you can introduce yourself.
My name is Dr. Margaret Harris, and I'm actually the spokesperson for the WHO Ebola team in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And yes, Dr. Fall asked me to support Mr. Gressley with any questions you need to ask about specifics of the public health response.
Thank you very much. So, as was just mentioned, this is the 1 year anniversary of the declaration of the outbreak in Mangina, which is just a few kilometers here from Beni City. In fact, in 2018, on the 2nd of August, the next day, I traveled with the Minister of Health to bring not only himself, but also a team of responders, supplies, equipment, laboratory to Mangina to try to get this epidemic under control as quickly as possible. I have to say, I never thought that 1 year we'd still be talking about the same outbreak. And so I think it's important to understand why that outbreak has persisted. But before I do that, I do want to mention that we traveled today to Mangina to be with the people of Mangina on this 1 year anniversary. And I have to say it was a very, very moving day with the community. They held a memorial mass in remembrance of those who lost their lives in this fight against Ebola. But we also saw very many hopeful signs. We had the testimony of many survivors who talked about how it was to be a patient of Ebola, but also the fact that they survived, and what kind of advice they're taking back to people about the importance of early detection and treatment for survival. And some of these were quite emotional. We had even a very young girl who spoke to us. We saw other facilities while we were there, the Ebola Treatment Center, and there another hopeful sign. In fact, they discharged 3 more survivors today from the Ebola Treatment Center there in Mangina, and it's done with joy. It was really another very emotional, positive moment in this tragic situation. They survived, and there was singing and dancing and escorting them back into the communities from which they came. And we had a chance to talk to them about their experience and their hopes for life, which for many of them a few days ago seemed not so possible. And then finally, and I think it's important to note this, we had a chance to meet with the frontline workers, those who are from the government, from WHO, UNICEF, IOM, from international NGOs like International Mercy Corps, who was running one of the facilities there. They live in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. They live in dormitory tents. They eat whatever is available locally, but with great morale and great camaraderie. It was really quite uplifting to see them. Some of them have worked there, I talked to, for the last 12 months, in fact. So there's great dedication on the ground to try and wanting to overcome this particular disease. But why has it persisted? I think it's an extremely important question to ask, because that will only guide us to solutions for the future. Basically, the primary factors are, first of all, the context. This is the most difficult environment in which an Ebola response has ever been attempted. The environment is difficult because of the high density of population. It's difficult because it's a conflict zone and has been for the last 25 years. It's an area of opposition politically that has felt marginalized, with a high distrust of local authorities, all of which make it very complicated to work here. It was also heavily affected by the decision of the National Electoral Commission not to hold presidential elections at the end of 2018. And that created a lot of suspicion about Ebola, whether it was real or not, or why it was used as a pretext not to hold the elections. Fortunately, we have passed that period, and they held delayed elections at the end of March. But nonetheless, for that period of 3 months, the whole response was heavily politicized. And we suffered many attacks on Ebola treatment centers at that point in time. Earlier here in Beni, we also faced a lot of difficult days because of the threat of the Allied Defense Forces, which repeatedly attacked the city of Beni and surrounding areas, killing civilians, as well as attacks on military installations. It was only the peacekeeping mission's offensive operations in November that pushed them back out of the area of Beni, that created the space for the Ebola responders to do their work. Unfortunately, in that offensive, 7 soldiers died from the peacekeeping mission, one more sacrifice in the fight against Ebola here. So where are we today? At the 1-year mark, it's clear, I think, to everyone that a pure public health response by itself is not adequate. And the government has announced major shifts in its planning for the response. It's lifted the responsibility from the Ministry of Health to the level of the President, and it's being run out of the presidency. I think it's a very strong signal to all components of the government that they should be working together to find solutions to bring this epidemic to an end. Likewise, the United Nations and its partners are doing the same. This is no longer just a WHO-led effort. All of the agencies and all of the NGOs who have something to contribute have come together to work on this, to overcome all of the problems. And I could summarize those problems probably in 3 ways. Number one, we need to stop the kinds of interruptions that have affected this response since the beginning. The attacks that I've described, but also other events, political demonstrations, strikes over non-payment of salaries. I could go through a long list of things that have interrupted the response. The difficulty with an interruption, even for a day, allows the virus to multiply and to spread to multiple individuals. And you often lose weeks for 1 or 2 days of interruption. So we cannot afford to continue with those interruptions. Secondly, there's still too many gaps in the response. Either geographically, there are zones that are at risk where the virus can come into, and we don't detect it as quickly as we should. And we need to be able to anticipate where the virus is going, not chasing it around once it starts to replicate in a new area. And the other thing that we have seen over the last, particularly the last few weeks, is we're seeing the epidemic move from originally Mangina, that I mentioned before, to Beni here, and then further south to the major city of Butembo, where it was extremely difficult, but good progress has been made. We hardly have any cases there, but in the meantime moved back into Mangina and Beni. So that cycle also has to stop. We need to protect our gains and then push forward in those areas that remain so that we can bring this to an end. And that goes to the third point I want to highlight that I think will be essential in the new strategy, and that is to review all the basics of how to control Ebola. We have new technologies, the vaccines have been extremely helpful in limiting the response, but the basics are still important, and the basics include good surveillance, good contact identification from an Ebola patient, tracking those same individuals to see if they develop the symptoms, and if they do, testing and isolation if they are actually positive. That's the way that you break this epidemic. And if you can apply that strictly, we can bring this to an end quickly. So we need to review where those weaknesses are as well. So we have many challenges, I think, ahead. It's not going to be easy. We had a recent case in Goma, in which it looks like there's more than one individual that has been that's infected. It's a stark reminder that as long as it circulates in this area, it can move into a new area like Goma. We had a case that crossed into Uganda. We had another case that was close to the border with South Sudan. And the longer it continues to circulate in this area, the more likely we'll see a chain of transmission established in another part of this country or a neighboring country. And we really can't afford to do that. So the preparedness and the readiness along the borders, but within the borders of the DRC as well, it's important that we protect the major cities that are not yet affected, so it doesn't move into those areas while we focus. We have to keep our eyes on target everywhere. And maybe just to conclude, I think it's important to note that this is an area that has suffered from much. The Allied Defense Forces have killed as many people as Ebola has killed. We're talking 1,700 people, 25 years of conflict, 1 million IDPs still in this area. This is an area that has suffered for a quarter of a century. They don't need the extra burden of Ebola, which is dragging down education systems, dragging down health systems, and creating a great deal of difficulty even for doing business here. So we are committed to finding a way forward to solve this. I think we have a good, solid plan. We're getting good commitments for funding, but that needs to be consistent over time, and that funding needs to be properly targeted so we don't have the gaps that I referred to. And I think with our work with the World Bank, who is helping us in that regard, we'll have such a tool for funding this. We just need to make sure the funds come in. And then all of our partners in the government need to make sure the right people at the right levels are on the ground taking care of this. And I think we can bring this one to an end. But I have to say, I think it will be a long fight. It will be a hard fight. But with vigilance, we need vigilance, as I've mentioned before, with discipline, and it will take discipline and determination, we can see this through. And then we can bring this epidemic to an end. So let me conclude there. I don't know, Margaret, if you would like to say a few words at this point.
Just mostly to underline exactly the things you said, that without access to communities, all the public health techniques and tools we have are useless. If we have one person who doesn't trust, who decides that they need to hide their illness because they are frightened of us, they think we are not people that they trust, and they do not believe that we're people there to do good. If that person hides, that person goes to another area, infects another area, the epidemic continues. So all the work that Mr. Gressley's been talking about, increasing the support for better security so that the public health teams can go in, but also building trust with communities, demonstrating to the community here that we are actually here for good and for a useful purpose. That we feel will make a difference. Also placing our teams as close as possible to wherever the infection is burning so that we are close to community. And Mr. Gressley described the camp we have way out in the forest where the staff are all working, staff in all sorts of disciplines, so that the work can be done at community level and the community knows us and knows that we are there to do what we all want to do, make a difference and stop this outbreak.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Back over to New York. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentations. We will now take questions. If you can kindly introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Mr. Gressley and Dr. Harris, thank you for this briefing on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association. My name is Sherwin Bryce-Pease. I'm with South African Broadcasting. Mr. Gressley, if I could start with you, could you talk about the closing of the Rwandan border with the DRC? Is this useful? Does this help? The Congolese government has protested this, saying it goes against WHO guidelines. What do you say? And Dr. Harris, you've touched on this in your earlier statement. I want you to describe the posture of the local community and the difficulties you encounter just with people accepting your presence there. What are some of the concerns? And is education not penetrating to the extent that it should?
Should we go? Okay, on the first part of the first question, the border is actually now open with Rwanda. I'm not currently in Goma to explain to you exactly what happened this morning. But there may have been more procedures put in place. But the bottom line is, as of this afternoon, the border crossing between Goma and Rwanda is open. But I can use this to also explain what you were asking about. We don't believe that this is very helpful. This is actually not helpful at all. If a border is closed, in part because there's really good economic links, but also family links on either side of these borders. These are very populous areas. This is one of the most populated areas in the country. So there is a lot of movement across these borders, and maybe you have the statistics for that. But we're talking hundreds of crossings, if not more, per day. So it's counterproductive because it interferes with that. And then secondly, people will find another way. There are more remote areas where if you can't go across the main border, you can find a different way. And when that starts to happen, then the ability to check to see if people are symptomatic or not becomes that much more difficult. So it's actually quite counterproductive and not in the interests of either country concerned. So we certainly advise against that very strongly. And the recent declaration of a public health emergency of international concern specifically stated that, and WHO said that they were going to watch that very carefully and advise if any violations of those recommendations were to happen. So that's what I can tell you as of now regarding the border crossing in Goma. But over to you, Margaret.
Just to add, it's not so much a guideline, but it's part of the agreement when we declared the public health emergency of international concern. One of the things that happens then is all the member states agree to abide by the recommendations made by the Emergency Committee. And the Emergency Committee made it absolutely clear that a top-line recommendation was that borders should not be closed and that travel and trade should not be affected. And as Mr. Gressley said, these particular borders are really important for trade. The countries have masses of trade across those borders. Hundreds of thousands of people cross, trucks, all sorts of things going on. So closure of the border causes a great disruption to the countries involved, but also exactly as Mr. Gressley said, this sends an epidemic underground. And we've seen this throughout history. If you look at the history of the Black Plague, that's exactly what happened as well. If you start making people terrified, you close things down, they run away, they hide, and they spread disease. You had another question which is about community. And it's a good question and a tough question because there's no such thing as just one concept community. Every different group is different. Butembo's not Beni, Beni's not Goma. The bits of Beni are different from each other. So in each place we go, we have to listen. It's not so much about educating a community, it's about listening to what they think of us. And that takes time. And it also takes responding to what they say. It's not just about listening and writing it down, but thinking about what you can really take action on and show that you are a genuine partner, that you are genuinely making them own the work that you are doing. And sometimes in an emergency, that gets lost in the speed and the speed and the desire to shut something down. The time to listen and let the community own can be problematic, and it is one reason, though, why we're still here.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris, Mr. Gressley. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. We have been very interested in this outbreak in terms of spreading and care. And the question is, how much does the distrust of the vaccine play a part? Can you speak to that? Thank you. And what have you done to alleviate that and change that? You said recently to us the vaccines are there, but it's not necessarily getting to the communities. And also the Francophone issue. People that you need more people who can actually communicate. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start and I'll let Margaret maybe finish on this. Of course, on the last part of the question, ideally, people who speak French or even better Swahili, which works extremely well here, makes a big difference when you're working on the ground. So we're constantly looking, but I think we have a pretty good success rate in getting those people on board. It's always a bit of a struggle, but we have quite a large number here already. In terms of distrust, the vaccine has been widely accepted. I wouldn't say universally accepted. And it's probably done a great deal to confine the outbreak in the current area that we see, this area in North Kivu, a bit into the Ituri province. And it's probably helped a great deal to limit the spread, and has given us the time to try to get this response right. That's how I would describe that. But in terms of the numbers, I don't know if you want to give some statistics on that. Yes, go ahead.
So in fact, we've got a 95% acceptance of the vaccine, which is extraordinary when you consider what we see in the rest of the world with vaccines that have been around for a very long time. But Ebola is a little bit special because just one person not being vaccinated and then being infected can seed the virus everywhere else. So we really need 100% acceptance. So it's not acceptance of the vaccine. What we do struggle with is acceptance of being identified as a high-risk contact. So yes, we find all the contacts we think we know of, but there are people who hide their illness, who flee, who go to another place, who think that being taken to the Ebola treatment center is like being taken to the death house, which I have to say is really quite extraordinary when you go to the Ebola treatment centers and you see what an incredibly high standard of care there is and how there's enormous humanity. They really do their utmost to look after people in a very caring and special way. They keep a survivor in the room at all times with the person who has Ebola so that they know they have someone who really understands what they're going through and really will look after them and isn't in that spacesuit, isn't in the frightening PPE. They're just wearing normal clothes. And there have been so many innovations to make the care really humane and really, really good. Myself, I was in the West African outbreak, and I must say, I wouldn't have been keen to be in an Ebola treatment center, But if I was ill this time, I would be happy to be treated here in the Ebola treatment centres we have here. So, but changing that perception is difficult. So people still think that being identified as someone with Ebola is the worst thing that can happen to them. And it's those people who are hiding and going somewhere else. So it's not so much the people we know of, they want to be vaccinated. It's the people we don't know of.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, hello, thank you, doctors. Stefano Vaccara, La Voce di New York and Radio Radicale in Rome. First of all, if you can just confirm there is about 1/3 survival rate of who gets affected by this disease, about from what the numbers that were given. And then my question is, from those last news that we got from there, what do you expect from us to do? I mean, do you think that this is like a big news? We should spread it. Goma, a city of 1 million people, has a case of Ebola. It can be a disaster, big headlines. Or you think that this actually doesn't help and should be instead more about what we were talking before, is how to contain, you have all the way to contain it, but you need still help. What I mean is how we should deliver the news, because I'm a little bit confused about that.
Well, first, the first part of your question, yes, it is about, on the average, about a third survival rate, but that's dependent on how quickly someone presents themselves for care. The earlier that happens, the higher the survival rate. And so we're not getting people there soon enough. I think we could see a better survival rate if we did. So that's unfortunate. And that's one of the things that need to be worked on. But in terms of how to present this, it's not useful to present this in a panicked way. That doesn't really help because this is a disease that can be managed. This is something that can be eradicated from this area. It's just extremely hard. And so I think the message is that this is a highly unusual Ebola outbreak because of the context in which it's taking place, with the conflict and the various other dimensions that I've described. It's just made it extremely difficult, but it's still quite doable. It will need time. It will need determination, as I mentioned earlier. It will need continued resources coming in to sustain this. It will need a strategy that is comprehensive. But all of these are doable things. They're not impossible. So I think a message of determination, a message that we need to do this so it doesn't remain a threat. So we need to be operating at a high level of intensity on this and high intensity of support for this is how I would try to describe this. And we need to bring this under control quickly, as quickly as possible, because if we don't, it has the risk of moving elsewhere. That, in my mind, is a very real risk here in this situation. But maybe you want to try, see if you want to further characterize it.
Well, again, I just support what you said. But it's exactly right. If people come late to the Ebola treatment centre, like in the last phases, if they've been symptomatic for 7 or 8 days, their chances of survival are very, very poor. 90% chance of death. Now, if they come really early, like when they first develop a fever, their early symptoms are very high fever, splitting headache. If they come at that point, if they're identified at that point, 90% chance of survival. So the difference is stark, but we haven't got that message through. So that's why I keep going on about good engagement with the community. And this is one of the great reasons for having such a wide partnership and having such a wide group. WHO does public health. We do work with community, but we need many more partners who understand all the dimensions and all the problems the community have and can respond to the problems the community have so that they do begin to trust us. They do begin to trust that when you get symptoms, when you get that headache, when you get that fever, for sure it might be malaria, but it could also be Ebola. Come and get help, because then they really will live. And we saw the survivors leave, and it is so heartening. And I know for all my team, that's what I've asked over and over again. What is it that gives you joy? And it's seeing those survivors leave, knowing they listened to the message, they came, they got cured, and they're going back to help their communities.
So, back over to New York.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. This is Alejandro Rincon with NTN24 International News. And I'm wondering whether or not you're facing right now any challenges, but in terms of the resources that you have available to fight this outbreak. And if so, do you have any appeal or any message on this particular matter?
Well, on that, I think there's the key. The World Bank announced, I believe it was last week, that they would be willing to put forward up to $300 million in credits and grants to the DRC for this response. We have pledges already from other countries. Now we're finalizing the plan that will take us through, we're doing this with the government obviously, take us through the end of the year. I think in the end we will probably get those resources, but they need to come on time. So it's more the timeliness of these resources and the targeting of these resources that is the critical issue here, so that we get the right organization funded at the right time. And we're working with donors on how we can get that organized. Unlike a humanitarian appeal where you might be able to stagger things over time, it's really difficult with an epidemic to do that. You need to have the right thing going on every day at the right place. There is no room for gaps. So some new tools are being developed to help in that regard. And I think that will help better target and better utilize those resources. But those resources will still need to come. And there will be a post-Ebola phase as well. And we need to be ready and start to prepare for that. The impact will last for years once this is over. We will have survivors who will need to be monitored for years for further treatment, not for Ebola, but for the impact of Ebola on them, but also the possibility that they could actually retransmit Ebola one more time. And so we have to have a very good surveillance system in place. Then you have the impact on the communities because of the stresses placed on the health systems, education systems, and so forth, and psychological care. So there will be a need for continued resources going forward. And then while we talked about the language, there is a need to have the right personnel as well. And we need to have those mobilized much more quickly. We do get people coming in, but not always as quickly as we can. So it would be good for member states to really find creative ways to get the kinds of expertise on the ground that we need. And it's not just health expertise, it's across the board, from security, the kind of community engagement, political engagement. These are all skills that are required. And as I mentioned, we have to fill those gaps. And those gaps are not filled only by money, but by people. And so it's that combination that we really want to see come in at this point in time.
And yes, I just add, what is also going on is that as the outbreak continues and all this work that Mr. Gressley is referring to occurs, the people we rely on are very much local people. So we're doing a lot of training, not just training, but people are getting experience in all these areas of work, because you don't just come in, impose your way on somebody, do something and leave. That doesn't work. Even if we thought it was a good idea, it leaves nothing behind in a country. And it's very clear here, this is a society that already thinks that people do exactly that, come in, leave, don't help. What we're doing a lot of, and we're finding now with our team, the vast majority of our team are now local people, and they're local people who've had the skills and expertise, and we've had to build more and more. But the other thing we want to leave behind is a really strong, resilient health system, and that's going to take a wide range of resources, human and financial, because if we do not leave a resilient health system behind, we will be back again with the same problems.
Are there any additional questions from the room here? No, so that's it. Thank you very, very much for taking the time in your very busy schedule, Mr. Gressley and Dr. Harris, for being with us today. We really appreciate. We invite you to come back anytime. And thank you so much to all of you for being with us today. Thank you.